So what is happening tonight is something rather different. I want to explain something about this talk before I started. The origins of this talk was, I think, probably my first PowerPoint, or it may not have been PowerPoint presentation I ever did. And it was for an interview for a teaching job, which I didn't get. And they asked me to do a presentation on why history was important, or why is history an important subject, to put it in the school situation. So this talk is based on that, but it's enlarged, extended, and there are twice as many slides as there were in the original. I made sure of that in the last few days. Oh, by the way, would all of you who are here please kindly mute yourselves at this stage? And could, sorry, is Lisa, make sure, Lisa, are you recording?
Yes, I am.
Good. So that's the origins of this talk. It's shorter than normal, probably about 35 minutes, because the intention is that we'll open this topic up to questions. And I want to check how many of you are still awake during it. So I have a question. My wife knows one of the answers, so I'm not going to ask her to give it to you. Two people who are illustrated in this talk are still alive, to the best of my knowledge. So let's see who's the first one after the talk to guess who those, or to know who those two people are. I'm talking about the slides, not me personally. I am alive, just to let you know that as well. History, of course, is a passion of mine, so this is very much my topic. Right, let me start. History is about the past. And as the cliche tells us, you cannot change the past. So why bother with history? Past societies were different from ours and had different values. So how can they teach us anything helpful? Such questions boil down to this. What use is history? Why study it? Why teach it? Why discuss it? Jane Austen, who incidentally is not alive, I'll give you that one, put these words in the mouth of Catherine Morland in her book, Northanger Abbey. I hope you can read it on the screen. I can read poetry and plays, things of that sort, and do not dislike travels. But history, real solemn history, I cannot be interested in. Can you? Okay. I read it a little as a duty, but it tells me nothing that does not either vex or weary me. The quarrels of popes and kings, with wars and pestilences on every page. The men all so good for nothing, and hardly any women at all. It is very tiresome. This talk, by the way, was first given, original was 2008. I should point this out as I go on from here. Tony Blair proclaimed to the American Congress, "There has never been a time when, except in the most general sense, a study of history provides so little instruction for our present day." Such questions and assertions are based on the premise that history is an isolated subject, separate from all the others. The opposite is the truth. The Greek word historia means an investigation or inquiry. For them, it was a far cry from the list of dates, kings, and battles that used to be the staple diet of history, of so much school history. Herodotus was famously referred to by Cicero as the father of history. He traveled widely throughout the known world, collating information and throwing light on the folklore, religions, customs, civilizations, interests, and conditions of its people, and on the geography of the lands he visited. Furthermore, as Michael Grove wrote, that the histories of Herodotus include almost every variety of prose and may be the source of certain literary forms. Incidentally, there's a lot of material in Herodotus that we wouldn't know else if it wasn't for him. Thucydides studied the background and reasons for the Peloponnesian War and was in it, and the conduct, and did so with such employment of the critical faculty that he claimed to have used only the plainest evidence and have reached conclusions which are reasonably accurate when investigating even the most distant past. According to the American classical historian John Marincola, Thucydides was dissecting with acuity and impartiality the true and underlying causes of human actions. In this way, these first two great historians established not only the task of the historian, but also the breadth of history itself. In the words of the Roman historian Livy, to whom I shall return, in history you have a record of the infinite variety of human experience plainly set out for all to see. It follows that history is the best place of all the humanities for an interdisciplinary approach. E.M. Forster's dictum of only connect should be instilled into the mind of every budding historian. Years ago, I was talking to a fellow tutor on a revision course. He was a geographer, and he told me that he was teaching the unification of Italy. I immediately retorted, but that's my subject. He soon demonstrated to me the relevance of its relevance to geography. History is about human beings, human societies, human failures, and human achievements. So much to do with the human past has some relevance to history. History links up with geography, archaeology, philosophy, theology, politics, economics, and sociology, just to name some of the most obvious examples. Let's take the example of Christian theology. Biblical criticism has asserted that the scriptures must be viewed through their historical and cultural context. Secondly, scripture must be tested by those disciplines which lie beyond its revealed purpose: history, archaeology, geology, paleontology, astronomy, physics, etc., provided that they in turn remain answerable to evidence and verifiability. The historicity of the scriptural record must therefore be subject to the same criteria as any other text that has been handed down, copied, translated, and interpreted. It is, after all, not a single book. Even Protestants, who have a shorter, smaller Bible than Catholics and Orthodox, acknowledge 66 books written over several centuries, possibly more than a millennium. Almost 2,002 further millennia have passed since the writing of the New Testament. As John Henry Newman rightly affirmed in his essay on development in 1845, Christianity has been long enough in the world to justify us in dealing with it as a fact in the world's history. History is not simply the study of the past. Indeed, as Simon Schama has pointed out, from Thucydides onwards, the past has been studied to understand its connection with the present. When he was running for the American presidency, John F. Kennedy was asked what he considered his most important asset. He replied that it was his sense of history. However, in his inauguration speech, Kennedy highlighted the fact that with him, leadership had passed to a new generation born in the 20th century. Nevertheless, he asserted that the influence of America was only to be understood through an historical perspective, which also enabled him to discern what the historical forces are that are moving in our own day. He read Barbara Tuchman's The Guns of August about the onset of the First World War, and was determined that he would pursue all possible means to keep the peace over the Cuban Missile Crisis. We'll come back to that. So that no historian would need to write a similar book on the missiles of October. President Mitterrand of France chose to visit Sarajevo as the Bosnian crisis escalated on the 28th of July, 1992, in the hope that the anniversary of the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand might underline the gravity of sparking off a conflict in the Balkans. Unfortunately, the events leading to the Great War were by then so distant in time for the world's media to grasp its significance. Human memory is so short that historians are needed for the longer view. One of the most important tasks of the historian is to approach any historical issue with a realization that attitudes, opinions, criteria, and perspectives, indeed whole mindsets, were very different in past centuries and even decades. Slavery is now regarded almost universally as not only unacceptable, but also abhorrent. But such was not the case in Europe and North America before the 19th century. The necessity of cultivating the skill to be able to view an issue from at least two opposing or differing viewpoints is something that was drummed into me at school. And I have sought to inculcate it on countless occasions while teaching students how to write essays. It is one reason why I sought, I should say, to promote debating societies in schools and colleges. I have learned much about teaching international. I have learned much from teaching international students. Students and colleagues from countries in the former Soviet Union have been particularly illuminating. My father was at school with two distant cousins of the last Tsar and wanted to join the Allied expedition to fight with the Whites against the Red Army in 1919. He loathed communism and was very alarmed and annoyed that I had chosen it for a school project at the age of 16. Then went to see the local party secretary after I got permission, and subsequently became a communist, albeit for only 2 months. I'll tell you more about that later if anybody asks. After that, I had spent most of my adult life under the conviction that Stalin had done nothing of real benefit for his people, and much to their detriment, until one Russian colleague helped me to see more clearly what Stalin had achieved, and why he is still seen as the man who finally industrialized his country, dragged it into the 20th century, led it to victory against Hitler, and on to superpower status. I was discussing the Cuban Missile Crisis with a 16-year-old Latvian pupil of Russian descent, who exclaimed, "It was all due to Kennedy's aggression." I was initially startled, but then tried to view the crisis from Khrushchev's perspective. Time doesn't allow me to go into this, but I hope that our discussion might do so, and some of our Russian friends will stay on and express their own viewpoints, if you can stay awake. Sometimes teenage students have really astonished me by their sheer ignorance of their own country's recent history. A Polish colleague with Jewish ancestry who had grown up there in Warsaw during the war was in conversation with a young German student during a revision course about 15 years ago. She told me about this. We were both on the revision course. The German exclaimed, "But Germany was neutral in the Second World War." A pupil from Stalin's home state of Georgia did himself manage to shock me when he proudly announced to me, "Stalin was a good man, just a little brutal." We may laugh at such misconceptions, but they can have consequences. There are many in Russia today who yearn for another Stalin, and the country is already returning to authoritarianism, or indeed has already done so. History places our present in context and in perspective. In doing so, it helps us to understand that present. In global politics, it can alone help us to understand and resolve conflicts which are invariably rooted in it. For example, the historical perspective on the Arab-Israeli conflict takes us back not only to the creation of Israel, the Holocaust, the British Mandate, and the Balfour Declaration in the last century, but to the Ottoman Empire, the Crusades, the spread of Islam, the Roman occupation, and the Jewish diaspora. In an article I wrote, "The Policies of World Power, British Foreign Policy in the 19th Century," which I used incidentally quite extensively on a talk I gave last year, I concluded rather controversially that today's world leaders might reflect on Salisbury's caution about going to war in the age of modern technology, Castlereagh's insistence on non-intervention in the internal affairs of other nations, and Gladstone's pleas for a common humanity and the equal rights of nations. Yet at its heart, British foreign policy was concerned with national interest, then as it is now, and with our relations with our continental neighbours. In her famously Eurosceptic Bruges speech, Margaret Thatcher still affirmed, "We British are as much heirs of to the legacy of European culture as any other country. Our links to the rest of Europe, the continent of Europe, have been the dominant factor in our history." The highly influential German philosopher of history, Georg Hegel, came to the depressing conclusion: what experience and history teaches is this, that people and governments never have learned anything from history or acted on principles deduced from it. Many centuries earlier, Livy had set out to discover the history of Rome's rise to greatness and hegemony, and what he viewed as its cataclysmic moral decline. He asserted that in that historical record, You can find for yourself and your country both examples and warnings, the things to take as models, base things rotten through and through to avoid. History is more than Gibbon's register of the crimes, follies, and misfortunes of mankind. Circumstances change, power shifts, different ages face different challenges, and yet history demonstrates that human nature does not change, and therefore we can learn lessons from the past. One should nevertheless take seriously John Tosh's caveat, the idea that history teaches precise and prescriptive lessons is untenable. It can, however, serve to warn us, to guide us, and give us examples of either follow or avoid. It can point us to the future and tell us what not to do. If Hitler had learned his lesson from Napoleon Bonaparte's invasion of Russia, instead of pursuing his ideological war, then he would not have lost so many invaluable troops. Without those two invasions of Russia, the history of Europe might have turned out very differently. Hitler's great adversary, Sir Winston Churchill, knew the value of history in the politician. He wrote it and mobilized it into the fray. As an old man, he gave this advice to his 8-year-old grandson and namesake. Learn all you can about the history of the past. For how else can one ever make a guess at what is going to happen in the future? Much criticism was leveled at the skills which form the most radical innovations in the transition from O-levels to GCSEs in 1988. This was especially true of the somewhat bizarre examples that were employed to encourage empathy. One rather unreliable A-level student informed me that in 1988, he had been asked to imagine himself as a badger in Auschwitz. My immediate reaction, I hope it won't offend anyone, was to answer that he should dig a hole at full speed and get out before he was eaten. Empathy was soon dropped, but still the most fundamental criticisms remained. It was claimed that GCSE history tried to instill historical methodology and skills before the pupils had learned any real history. GCSE, I should point out to those of you who are not from this country, is the exam taught between the ages of 14 and taken from the age of 14 and taken at the age of 16 normally. And it precedes what A-levels. Indeed, it can be argued that those skills only really come into their own with a historical perspective at A-level, which is usually in the second year at A-level, so 17 to 18-year-olds. Another criticism was and is that the categories used are oversimplistic, especially over the neat divisions between primary and secondary sources, and between short and long-term causes. Many of these criticisms have some validity. Nevertheless, the fact remains that these skills are the tools of the historian. They also enable history to be used to much wider benefit. The question of causation is more than merely one of cause and effect. It can provide a valuable tool to the economist, the psychologist, the sociologist, the military strategist, and the politician, if only they would learn from history. Continuity and change are even broader in their application, as are similarity and difference. This takes me straight to the issue of sources. And this is what the famous Cambridge historian George Macaulay Trevelyan referred to as the sifting of evidence. My generation grew up with a clear distinction between prehistory and history. The Sumerians from Mesopotamia in modern-day Iraq are generally believed to have invented writing. Thus, we enter into history. They used ideographic writing. An ideograph is a graphic symbol that represents an idea instead of a word. Therefore, an ideographic writing system is a writing method that uses graphic symbols to represent objects and ideas. Ideographic writing uses written symbols to express those whole words, one word, one symbol, regardless of sound content. If a community's spoken vocabulary contains 10,000 words, then 10,000 symbols must be learned from written language. History is concerned primarily with written sources, and therefore prehistory concerned the comparatively vast period of human existence for which no written sources existed or are extant. Archaeology without written verification is insufficient for the study of history. Yet, archaeology is undeniably an important tool for the historian. So much of what we know of ancient civilizations come to us through the medium of archaeology. The period of Western European history that followed the fall of the Roman Empire used to be called the Dark Ages, because it was supposed to have been one in which had initiated when the former Roman Empire was devastated by barbarian hordes. Archaeology has demonstrated that many of those barbarians left us artifacts and displayed signs of cultural heritage. Yet they remain dark for another reason: the paucity of written sources. Thus, the student of ancient history may need to grapple with hieroglyphs, ideographic writing and evolving alphabets, with archaeological artifacts and data, with fragmentary evidence and the victor's versions, coinage, and artistic depictions. The student of contemporary history has, by contrast, an ever-increasing diversity of a variety of evidence through the evolution of printed, photographic, cinematic, phonographic, and electronic media. Indubitably, this accounts for the unfortunate concentration on the 20th century at GCSE. Historians work with those records of the past that have survived. We cannot do otherwise. Some books from ancient authors refer to works that are no longer extant, so that all we have are the fragmentary extracts that they included and selected. History is therefore primarily that which has been recorded in writing, I mean. Oral tradition before the invention of sound recording and accepting those few examples that remain of the bardic tradition has come down to us through written sources. Homer, writing around the 8th or 9th century BC, collated oral traditions that dated back at least 4 centuries to the Trojan War of the mid-13th century. Herodotus collated both oral traditions and information from sources that have long since disappeared. As we get closer to the present day, so the variety of sources grows considerably. Almost finished. Increasing specialization has put our disciplines in their little boxes. Nearly every discipline has been subdivided. Attempts at fusion often do little more than students into alien territory, then move their students into alien territory. The biochemist is still a scientist. We need to, but this panoramic breadth of vision of the ancient humanities. As I've attempted to show, history can provide the basis for the interconnectedness canvassed by the great German historian Leopold Ranke. Because of its essential focus on the entirety of the human experience of the past, it can draw together the insights of other disciplines and give back to them the long view that is so often lacking. One contributor to the Dictionary of Ideas observed that the House of History has many mansions, and each has an almost infinite number of windows. The philosopher Karl Popper wrote, "There is no history of mankind. There are only many histories of all kinds of aspects of human life." Herbert Butterfield affirmed in his influential attack on the Whig interpretation of history, "The truth of history is no simple matter, all packed and parceled ready for handling in the marketplace." Final slide. The proper study of history is a broadening experience that opens up all the insights of the past onto a contemporary worldview that is increasingly being torn from the past and leaves human beings without a sense of belonging and devoid of the nourishment of their roots. It is not surprising that in such a vacuum, the interest in family history is mushrooming. People need to know not just who they are, but where they came from. The same is true of all human communities and societies as the pace of change becomes faster and faster. We live in an age that seems threatened not only by terrorism, but by portents of environmental catastrophe and the anonymity of an ever-increasing globalization. People need to know whether we have felt similar threats before, and what light can the experience of our forebears shed on our predicament. This is only part of the contribution the history of our human past can make on our fleeting present, as we allow it to cast its illumination over the choices we must make for our children and the future of our planet. Thank you.